Hello, and welcome to State of the Revolution. This week, the power of progressive organizing was put to the test for the first time since 2016. Progressive candidates did well up and down the ballot across the country. While there's a narrative out there that says that this somehow wasn't a blue wave, or it was certainly a pink wave, and it was in fact a blue wave, with the Democrats taking more seats in the House than they've taken pretty much since the Nixon administration during the midterm election. So what can we learn from the results of this election, and what's the position for Democrats and progressives going forward? To discuss this with me today, I have Desirae Simmons, recently an independent candidate for City Council in Ypsilanti, Michigan; Hudson Villeneuve, an organizer with NextGen America; and Yousef Rabhi, recently reelected to the Michigan State House, and just yesterday elected by his caucus to be the floor leader. Well known, by the way, to be one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive member of the Michigan State House. So that's a huge win for progressives in Michigan. So opening up the conversation here, I want to talk about first, what is the big takeaway that everybody has from the midterm elections that we just had? Anybody want to go?
Well, I guess I can start. I think
Sure.
one of my big takeaways is, one of the things that we're seeing is that we have candidates that won on Tuesday that really put their progressive values front and center, and they won in red districts. And even in other parts of the country, in Florida and in Georgia, where we had progressive candidates running on that strong progressive message, they actually came out strong. And even if they didn't win those races, they showed, and in Texas too, they showed, they showed the country that you can run a progressive campaign and you can still come out strong. But even in Michigan, we had, Lori Pohutsky, for example, in Livonia, who flipped a red seat, that Laura Cox seat. She was the chair of our Appropriations Committee, powerful ranking member of the Republican caucus. She didn't even win her Senate election that she was running for. So Republicans lost that Livonia seat, and Laura Cox is not going to join us in the state Senate. And Lori ran on a campaign of, she put right on her lit, I'm a Democrat. I support Planned Parenthood. I'm supported by Planned Parenthood. I'm a gun sense advocate. She supported single-payer health care, and she put all that right out there, right on her literature. That's not usually advised, right? Our candidates that are running in these tough, swing districts, the standard operation is don't even put that you're a Democrat on there, right? But she did. She put it right on there. She put all her values right on there. And I know because I read the lit and I handed it out to a lot of doors. So,
Yeah.
So it shows that you can win on those progressive values. And that's, I think, one of the things that we learned in this election is, sometimes running away from that is counterproductive, and actually just being honest and truthful to who you are. And those progressive values is really important.
Can I just jump in here, just because I think that for me, even with what you're saying, it's about kind of storytelling, and it's about doing things differently, and introducing old school politics and ways of organizing to new people, with also capitalizing on the anger, the distress, and the desire that people have to see things being done differently, which is why, I've been really pumping up, all of the women of color that really took charge and led some of these things, even with some of the propositions here in Michigan, right? That those were spearheaded. That was a woman who's I'm tired of this happening this way. We need to do something. And I think that that's going to take us really far if we focus on the relationship building it takes to really get people to buy into the story that you're trying to tell, and to vote according to that.
I think you guys both hit the nail on the head there. It's about two things. It's about progressive ideals are attractive to a large demographic of people, but it's also about grassroots organizing from the bottom up. There were a lot of campaigns that started with just everyday people being fed up with the system and taking action into their own hands and not letting corporations or these big money politicians tell them they couldn't do it. We had a lot of people knocking on doors that never knocked on doors before. In this election, we had a lot of people voting that never voted before in elections, especially out of young people getting involved in politics for the first time. And I think that sets us up really well for the future.
So a couple of things there. I want to actually emphasize some of the numbers a little bit more, because you get the impression a lot of the time from the media narrative that we're somehow like a divided country. We're not a divided country. Democrats won the popular vote across the country, as they have done consistently over the past, at least since 2000, and in fact going back to the Clinton era, with the exception of some of the House midterm elections. But this year, the Democrats won more seats than anything going back to the Nixon administration, and they won the national popular vote by something like 6%. Some of the numbers aren't quite in yet, so that might actually go up. So this is the second time in a row that Trump and his ideals and the ideals of the Republicans that follow him have been soundly defeated by a majority of Americans across the country. The problem is our system was designed by wealthy white men who owned land, kept slaves, and feared democracy. So it's not designed for the people to actually get their voices heard. And one of the things that I think is the most significant across the country is I believe there's 3 states, including Michigan, that passed reforms to reduce the impact of gerrymandering. Our Prop 2 here. We had Prop 4 passed in Florida, which re-enfranchised 40% of the black men in Florida and a total of 1.4 million Floridians overall. And I think that one of the things that we need to really keep in mind is that we're not in here with them; they're in here with us. And the problem is that we have a system that holds back the population from deciding what their government is like. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to confront more and more and more and more over the course of the next several election cycles. One more thing to point out. In the Senate races that were run by Republicans this time, first of all, the Democrats had a terrible map for that. But you put all of those Senate races together, and again, a majority of people who voted in a Senate race this cycle voted for the Democrat in the race. And we need to, I would say that we need to stop acting as if, well, okay, those are the rules, and some people lost. What we need to start saying is, hey, we believe in democracy, and democracy is one person, one vote, and that's not what we're getting, and we need to go get that.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to add, I think especially with the Electoral College at the presidential level, that could be an opportunity for us to really tackle that conversation. I mean, I've heard from Republicans at the state level here in Michigan that have started to say, we'd like to look at that. We'd like to explore maybe, Michigan joining the nationwide effort to get rid of the Electoral College, which I think is an important conversation that we need to be having that fits right into that. That's only one piece of this larger puzzle. But.
Right. Currently, just one statistic on that. In the Electoral College, if we had equal representation with everybody else across the country, Michigan would get 51 votes on the Electoral College. We currently get 16. We're underrepresented 219%. That's the fact. And the fact is that all but a very, very few number of very small states are underrepresented by well over 200%.
So something I wanted to bring up, I mean, obviously for me, I'm so focused on local races, and that was something that after Donald Trump was elected, that really kind of, I hyper-focused there, because that's where I really realized that, it's one thing to have folks turn out to vote, right? It's another thing to have folks engaged and understand what they're voting for and how it impacts their everyday life. And so something that I definitely saw in terms of thinking about what's happening and how we should really, as we're talking about building democracy, I think it's important for us to understand turnout will be kind of pushed, I think, by what's happening at state and national level, for sure. But how many people are going to be out knocking those doors? How many people are going to see how what's happening in those things impact their life and tell their friends and hold meetings with their neighbors and go over the ballot and, all these things that we do to turn people out? In between the elections, it's going to be what's happening locally. And I think that we really need to grab onto that, because as you're saying, more people, there were so many people I was meeting that they were like, this is the first time I came out to work for an election. I have people who have been very politically engaged, very involved, doing a lot of direct community organizing, who voted for the first time in this election because of what was happening locally, right? That those were the things that were turning those folks out. And so I think that we need to really think about this strategy being bottom up and top down and how they work together.
I would agree with that. I think a lot of people have this attitude, and a lot of the reason people don't vote is there's this not in my backyard attitude, where people don't see how things affect them on the national level or on the statewide level. From talking to students at the University of Michigan, where I organized this past election cycle, a lot of folks who had never voted before, who had never been interested in politics before, they're like, oh, I'm not going to vote. I just don't see how it affects me. But when you start to have conversations with people about how these policies do impact their lives and impact the lives of others, you can really get them engaged and get them out to vote. So we need to find ways to get people to see how these policies affect them on the local level and get them engaged in their communities.
And what I would add to that too, my other observation in terms of when you're talking about voter excitement, voter engagement, people wanting to get out to the polls and vote, I think focusing on those local candidates is important. And as somebody who came up through local government, you know, somebody who's running for a county commission, a city council seat, even a school board seat can excite a lot of voter enthusiasm. The other thing that I saw in this election that I wanted to bring up is the power of ballot initiatives to drive turnout.
Yep.
And in the past, we've seen ballot initiatives come forward that were pushed sort of at a top-down level by institutional powers that said, we would like this on the ballot. You know, whether it was really bad ballot initiatives that Maddie Maroon put on the ballot, or whether it was really good ballot initiatives that were put on the ballot by environmental organizations or labor organizations, you know, those didn't necessarily drive the same turnout as what we saw in this election, because proposals 1, 2, and 3 were really all driven by groups of citizens getting together and saying, you know, we're fed up and we're going to take our state back. And, you know, I mean, proposal 2 in particular is the example of that, and you brought that up earlier, of like, you know, that is the prime example of not only did they turn people out to get the signatures, and that's sort of like the first step, right? Is you're getting all these signatures, you're organizing people, you have 400,000 people that signed on your, and then you're out there talking to the voters. I mean, I think it had a huge impact on this election.
I think that's true. And I just want to say too, because early on, you know, there were going to be like 6 or 7 and, you know, citizen initiatives that had bubbled up.
Yeah.
So I think that you're right about that. That got a lot of people excited. And all of the issues were things that impact everyday life, right? You know, wages, sick time, you know, all those things that happen because of ballot initiatives. And so I think that's huge. I think you're right about that, because that's also a way that got people very specifically engaged in an issue.
And I just want to say, just to bring in some statistics again, one of the things that I was very interested to see is that every single one of the initiatives, 1, 2, and 3, outperformed every statewide candidate, Democrat or Republican, often by 500,000 votes or more. Republicans often by 800,000 or just under. I think the best performing candidate on the Republican side was James, and Prop 3 outperformed him by 791,000 votes or something like that, and outperformed Democrats as well by hundreds of thousands of votes. So that shows that there's really a bipartisan or nonpartisan, I would even say, support for reform of the electoral system, because that's what Prop 3 was. And Prop 2, by the way, if you look at them, it's really interesting. Prop 1 beat everybody. Again, statewide candidates beat them by hundreds of thousands of votes. And then Prop 2 by more, and Prop 3 by more. So those kinds of things, there is a constituency for that. It's larger than the constituency for either party. And I think that that's something that we need to, as progressives, focus on to try to move more election integrity and democracy, because that's, as I said before, that's the real issue, I think, in terms of getting towards the policies that most Americans believe in. I'm sorry, you were.
No, I was just going to add. I think those are all great points. I was just going to add one of the things that I do think happened too is when the Republicans in the legislature passed what would have probably been proposals 4 and 5 around the wages, increase the minimum wage and the paid sick time. I think we would have even seen greater turnout
Yeah.
if we had had those on the ballot. So in some ways, I think they succeeded in suppressing a little bit of turnout by putting those, taking those off the ballot. But fortunately, the other three proposals were still on there, and they couldn't do anything with the constitutional ones. So Prop 3 and Prop 2, they weren't allowed to touch those anyways.
Right.
But the fact that we got those three on there, I think, was a saving grace in the election.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, there's concern among a lot of Democrats and progressives that that the lame duck session is going to try to do something about the the minimum wage, or maybe try to erect some kind of a legal barrier for Dana Nessel, the Attorney General-elect, who's promised to shut down Line 5 on her first day, because literally it's already in violation, and basically she needs to walk into a court and say they're violating the agreement from that they originally signed, shut it down.
Yeah.
So what do you think, is that something likely to happen, or
I think both of those are likely to happen. I think the paid sick time and the minimum wage increase, which includes the minimum wage parity for tipped workers, that's going to be gutted. They've already introduced bills on day one. Day one back in session, they've already introduced bills. So they're coming straight after those. That's like one of their top priorities. I'm very, 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 very thankful that we don't have session until after Thanksgiving. That's 2 whole weeks of them not doing bad things. So that's good. But after Thanksgiving, things will be bad, and that's one of the bills I think that's going to move pretty quickly. There's a few bills, but yes, on Line 5, they're moving forward with this tunnel agreement. I've spoken with tribal leaders who have been, working on this issue for many years. There's concerns that they're moving forward with it. I've heard from others that there's concerns that they're moving forward with it. And I think what they're going to try to do ultimately is, lock the state into a deal around the tunnel that Dana Nessel can't back away from, and that Governor Whitmer can't back away from. So I think they're going to try everything that they can to lock that in. I think the path to that happening is a little fuzzier than the path to them gutting the minimum wage and the paid sick time bills. I think that's 95% sure that's going to happen. The pipeline, I'd put it at mid-60s, maybe 70% sure that's going to happen. But there's a lot more legal stuff that they need to be doing there first.
Are there things, I mean, I know you probably would, but I'm curious about something like that where, there's so much energy around Line 5 as an example, and I think that cuts across so many different groups. Right. Are there things that we can do? Are there things that we can organize to help to do anything about changing the environment that would allow us to get shut into something like that?
So I think that we need boots on the ground. I mean, we need people after Thanksgiving in Lansing. We need, I hope that there will be rallies and direct action taking place. I think that there are a number of groups. I know that there are a number of groups that have organized around the paid sick time issue and around the minimum wage issue. The Restaurant Opportunity Center being one of the main ones that are doing amazing work on that. And they've already been doing some accountability work across the state, bringing celebrities to Michigan to, push the issue forward and try to hold, people that voted for the bill accountable, right? So to say to Republicans, well, hey, you voted for that, you voted in favor of this, you voted yes on this, so, why are you going back on that commitment now? Even though it was very clear in Lansing when it was passing that they were passing it so that they could go back and gut it. And they were the Restaurant Association was there. They had restaurant owners there. They even had pulled in some tipped workers that they could find to advocate against their own self-interest in many ways, to come and say, we want you to pass this so that you can gut it later. That was their stated. I mean, I was in the hallway talking to them. They called me out there. They were like, "We want you to vote yes, so that we can gut it later." That was their intent from day one.
So what I mean, you guys have been organizing at a very local level, running for city council, and get out the vote and all of that kind of work that NextGen has been doing. And I know that NextGen is a pretty big organization that did a lot of mobilizing across the country. Do you think that there are groups like yours or local organizations like you created to run for office that are ready to step up and back up our politicians that are elected, whether they're in the minority or in the majority, to push the conversation in a way that makes it less and less tenable for, frankly, these authoritarians to pass stuff for the benefit of their donors, which is basically what they're doing.
Yeah, I think NextGen has created a new voting class that didn't exist prior to maybe the 2016 election. Our work in the state registered 39,000 new voters. We were active on 61 college campuses, and everyone talks about the millennial vote, but we were reaching this even newer generation, Gen Zers, these 18 to 22-year-old kids that are first-time voters, and activating them, and they overwhelmingly turned out for progressives. In East Lansing, where we organized in Michigan State, in the precinct we monitored, we quadrupled voter turnout. At the University of Michigan, we tripled voter turnout, and at Wayne State, we doubled voter turnout. We increased the percentage of people voting in East Lansing precincts from 13% to 52%, and that's kind of the numbers that we worked all year to get by registering new voters, by speaking to them about why politics matter and how policies affect them. And I think now that we have this active group of 18 to 25-year-olds, we can say, hey, we helped get you elected. Now what are you going to do for us? Are you going to shut down Line 5 like you said? Are you going to expand Medicare for all like you said? Are you going to work for these progressive policies that we voted you in to get? So it's almost like another faction that we can use and be like, hey, the youth voted for you. We're not going to do it again unless you do what you say you were going to do.
And I think that's the biggest thing for me. I was thinking, the idea of like the folks coming together to back up the politicians. I think what it is that the politicians need to be backing up the community. And I think that like if that's happened, if we start seeing that happening more and more, which I think, good progressive candidates who are, like I say, looking to do things differently and who are bringing that old school kind of outreach and relationship building back into politics, that you will see people showing up for those people, right? Because they know that when we ask you something, you actually respond to us. I mean, there are some folks, I'm not gonna, I don't have to call out names, but there are some people that, I know I've had interactions with, or not interactions, where I've tried to do outreach and I haven't heard from those folks. And we are keeping our eyes on them, right? Because we know that it's not good enough that you were gonna vote this certain party line. We want to know that you're going to go to bat for things that are important to us. And so I think that the boots on the ground come with the action, right? So there's some parts that we can say we can kind of float our judgment, we can suspend our judgment for a bit, and then that's where the impact happens. So I know I don't want to turn anybody out to do things that they will automatically just be disappointed in.
Right. I want to go a little bit into that a little bit more, because one of the concerns that I have is that I've been organizing with folks since the 2016 election. I did work for Bernie, and then afterwards organizing with progressives across the state. And one of the things that I repeatedly ran into is this idea that we're going to win this time. It wasn't that we've got a long series of elections where we're going to have a knockdown drag out about whether or not the people get to have the representatives that they want, and then get the policies that they want through the election of those representatives. And so I think that there are a lot of politicians. And unfortunately, a number of them are centrist or establishment. Lots of people don't like the names, but we can talk about what to call, how to identify. But there are certainly a group of Democrats who are not likely to be responsive to things like healthcare as a human right. We've been dragging that side of the party kind of kicking and screaming towards towards that kind of policy. And my concern is, how do we make sure that the progressive wave that underlies this blue wave? I mean, there are two key things that underlie this blue wave. One is women, and the other one is progressives. how do we keep them involved when we're not going to have victories right away? We had a big victory this Tuesday, but in terms of policy, there's still going to be a big fight because of how the system is set up to, 17% of the country elects 52% of the senators, that kind of a thing. So how do we keep them engaged in the long term, not just this election, but see it as a progress across many cycles to get towards what we want?
Can I just say, so winning isn't always the answer. Some of it's truth telling. So as I was knocking doors, I had some people say to me, I almost like fell on the ground. They were just like, well, what is your take on on taxes? And so before I could answer, like, we think we need more taxes, especially here. We need to be taxing people more. And I was like, nobody would ever say that. Right? But some of the folks that are progressive, right, they're thinking about what are the big issues, and do we actually have money to pay for those? And that threw me, right? Like as a politician, it's really hard to come out and say, I'm going to raise your taxes. But I think that this is part of that truth telling, right? Because for progressives to say the policies that we want to actually have happen, we need to be looking at taxes. And part of it's also being smarter with the money that we have. And obviously in local spaces, you can really think about how to be more transparent about that. And, all the steps, there's as you're saying, there's a long haul to get folks to the place where they feel like they understand what's happening. But I think that some of the incremental pieces, it's not always just about, did our candidate win? Did you get this policy passed? Sometimes it's like, did you raise this policy as an option in a way that we can at least make noise about? Did you tell us what this actually is going to take for us to pass? And that those are some of the things that I think will hold progressives, like people who are coming out to vote maybe for the first time because they're like really excited. That seeing politicians do that, I think, is also part of that movement, because it's part of saying that we are not going to just fall into the same story. That
we're going to tell a different story, and we're going to talk about different ways that we could do things. Right. What do you think? Is that, having worked with, you've worked with the next generation specifically, the next generation of voters that are going to be either at these polls every cycle, or we're not going to get very far. So what do you think about what she just said about how to motivate them and how to keep people engaged?
Yeah, it's definitely about building a movement rather than necessarily electoral success. It's about creating a culture of voting, and it's about educating people at a young age. A lot of these 18-year-old kids come into college not knowing anything about politics, not knowing anything about how policies affect them. From talking to students, I had to teach a lot of people about what gerrymandering was. People didn't understand that their vote essentially was diminished in our state. And once you engage people and talk to them about those topics, they get fired up and they're like, wait a second, I thought my vote counted. But when you're able to show people that their voices aren't being as heard, and when you're able to tell them, hey, you're letting all of our grandparents make our decisions for us, and we're not being heard at the table. We can give you a seat at the table. Here's how. People are responsive to that. And you have to start that at a young age, because if you wait until these 18 to 22-year-olds are 30 and they've seen many presidential elections and not much has changed for them in terms of student loan debt or cost of rent, things that affect students directly, young people directly, they're already going to be gone. They're too far gone. You have to engage them right in these formative years where they're passionate, have time and energy to get involved.
Right. What do you think from the side of what you're seeing from the elected politicians? How aware do you and receptive to what we're talking about here? A lot of folks in the Democratic Party are.
Well, I think there's varying degrees for each people, like you're saying. I think, so when I introduced my single payer for Michigan bill, I thought I would get 4 or 5 Dems to co-sign it. I got over 14.
Okay.
I got 14 plus me.
14 so, out of what, 53?
At the time, we had a 47-member caucus, 46-member caucus, because one of them had left to go run for mayor of Lansing. So at the time, there were 46
33%.
Yeah, which was way more than I thought I would get. So I think it's important to remember that we may have allies in places that we don't know, and there are some members, I think, that understand, that that may be more conservative on certain issues, like on guns, for example. You know, they may be very pro Second Amendment, but they may also be very pro single-payer healthcare.
Okay.
So I think that, you know, so I think the traditional fault lines of politics are sort of eroding, and we have new, you know, new people coming in who have different ideas and different ways of thinking about things. And I would say that a lot of our traditional Dem-based voters are working class, union voters, rural voters, people that live in areas where hunting is an important thing, where farming is an important thing. I think we're seeing that a message that is focused on people and populist ideas is actually resonating with them. They are sick of politics as usual. They're sick of corporations buying their way to bills. They're sick of them getting screwed out of healthcare. They're sick of them paying their taxes but not getting anything out of it, and seeing corporations get big tax breaks. They're sick of all that, and they feel that the only way to solve the problem is by sending people in who will just nuke the system, basically. And that's sort of why they voted for Trump, you know, because he said he would go in and nuke the system. So that's what they voted for. But I think if we can present a clear alternative to that, that isn't, you know, that isn't the Donald Trump, but that is, you know, saying we're going to take on trade in a way that helps working people. We're going to take on healthcare in a way that helps working people. We're going to take on all these issues with a focus on the people, you know, the people, and not the donors and not the corporations and not the big special interests. We want the people to be successful. And if as Democrats, you know, people from liberal communities like Ann Arbor can have that role, people from more conservative communities can have that role, but as long as that message that's focused on people and making sure that we're helping the individuals, the working people in the state to actually get a leg up, that's where we can be successful. When you're talking about raising taxes, you know, I don't even talk about it like that because the Republicans have made taxes such a bad. So what I talk about with the single payer thing is like, I don't mention taxes. I say the single payer bill will reduce expenses for working families, because that's what our goal is too, right? Our goal isn't just to say we want everybody to pay more taxes. We actually don't want that. Some people shouldn't be paying as much as they are in taxes. We want some people to actually pay less in taxes. In fact, we should have most people be paying less in taxes, which is why a big thing that we've been advocating for is a graduated income tax in the state of Michigan, where the top 6% are paying a little bit more, and 94% of Michigan residents pay less in taxes. That's like powerful stuff that can actually help help people out. So some of this is like taking the threads of Republican and Democratic messages and saying, well, let's not go through that traditional fault line of there's two sides of the table. Let's say, what are the ideas, you know, that we can sort of weave together to make that people-focused agenda that can move our state forward. And that's how I've been able to work with people. Talk about bipartisanship all the time, like, you know, on solar panels, right? Environmental issues. There's a bunch of Republicans that want people to be able to have the freedom to put solar panels on their house. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. I want that too. And so liberal me, and super conservative Republicans introduced a package of bills together. We had a big press conference. We were all standing there, all five of us. And it was like the far right and the far left all together doing something together because we found common ground. And that's what it should be about, is focusing on those issues that it's not doing that. So I think we can activate a lot of new voters just by putting that message out there and empowering people that feel disempowered. I mean, that's one of the, sorry I'm talking so much, but that's one of the things that I found, you know, I knocked doors in 25 districts across Michigan that were
we saw it all over Facebook.
And a lot of those districts, people were disenchanted, disenfranchised. They felt government was not working for them. They couldn't get a leg up, and it was just they were not interested in participating, and they wanted to affiliate themselves with a party that was going to be basically destroying the system as we know it. And that happens to be right now the Republican Party.
Well, so. I think it's so, you know, it's so interesting because I'm thinking about, you know, one of the things, you know, I ran as a nonpartisan candidate, and so I heard that all the time. I think people are talking about breaking boundaries everywhere. There's the physical boundaries that, people talk about breaking, but I think the interpersonal, it's like about the ways that we intersect, is that's really what's going to take us to that next place, is us being able to say, where are these different areas, understanding the different things that, resonate with people, and how does your message connect with that? And then people might be like, oh, okay, that's not so horrible. That's not so much what I thought you were trying to say. You do care about my issues too. And we can work together on
Right.
these different areas. And I think that that's going to be huge. It's about breaking out and saying, this isn't just about left and right? This is about people, as you're saying. This is about what is it that helps to make things better, and doing the work to get there. And it's hard work. It's not always glamorous, but I think that that's what people want to see. I know that, that was what I heard from people who are conservative in my area, who don't typically vote actually for local races, because they don't actually have an option, so they just don't vote there. And then for some really lefty
because Ypsilanti
folks,
because
of Ypsilanti it's a very strong Democrat hold.
Right.
So that just means that the Democrats have the full variety, right, of what might go into there. But anyways, that was something that I heard a lot of, that people were like, well, we feel that at least if you're going to approach this space, you're going to approach it from a space of listening and, telling truth. I told people, I told folks when I didn't agree with them, or when I wouldn't, push certain things that they wanted me to push, like, more policing in parks so that we don't have graffiti artists. I was like, that's not something I'm going to get behind, but I will get behind thinking about X, Y, and Z. So I think that seeing that in all the different levels of government is going to be powerful, and having good examples like what you're talking about, that we can lift up and say, see, this is how this works. I think that people want to get around something. People don't want to just hear, don't do this person because they're going to damage your life. They want to hear, this is what I'm going to do to help better your life. Right? That's what they want to hear about.
I think you touched on a good point, that people want to be listened to. They don't want to be told what to think, and I think that's part of why people feel disconnected with the traditional Democratic Party, is that they have this line of what they're being told to think or believe, but really people just want to be listened to, like, hey, my health insurance premiums are way too high, my car insurance is way too high. And I think that's why candidates like Beto in Texas, Abdul Sayed in the primary here, spoke to a lot of people who hadn't voted before, who were disenfranchised, and who need more candidates and people to listen to those communities, and not just whoever's writing them the biggest check. And that's a really important step that we need to take for the future.
So when you I think there's a little bit of a little bit of a divide between the organizing that you did, because on college campuses, that's a particular group of folks. And there's, when you talk about the ward that you ran in Ypsilanti or other places, you often have people that aren't of that economic status that they can afford to go to college. I think that I'm wondering if you mentioned before about the college loan issue that you. Are you seeing people that are thinking about that, also thinking about, beyond their circle of family, beyond their circle of friends, beyond the kinds of people that they know, recognizing that the kind of thing that they're having trouble with in terms of economics, there are other ways that other people are having that kind of problem? Because one of the things that conservatives try to use to divide us a lot is, this, elitist college folks versus, and the fact of the matter is that in a lot of cases, there's a lot of overlap of concern. So what's your perception of that from the people?
I think there is a little bit of an economic disconnect. We had people fill out these survey cards, and on these survey cards, they had a list of issues ranging from raising the minimum wage, LGBTQ rights, legalizing marijuana, and so forth. And we collected 23,000 of those as a state, and I personally collected probably about 2,000 of those at University of Michigan campus. And a lot of people left things like raising the minimum wage unchecked, but almost everyone checked LGBTQ rights. I think young people, even conservative young people, are socially liberal. They're the most tolerant generation yet, and they see humanity in other people in ways that previous generations necessarily haven't. So even if there's a disconnect on things like, maybe a college Republican doesn't want to raise the minimum wage, doesn't want single-payer health care, they see their LGBTQ brothers and sisters as people that deserve rights, which is a disconnect between the young people and the people in power. I think this generation truly does believe in people as people, but there is a little bit of an economic disconnect between kids who go to college who can afford it and don't see the struggles of working class people.
It's interesting because something I saw what happened locally, so in Ypsilanti and in Ann Arbor, is that, you do endorsements, you have these like huge lists of questions. So I did one for the Huron Valley Area Labor Federation and the Huron Valley Democratic Socialists of America. And the issues were all of these issues, as you're saying, about LGBTQ, criminal justice, as well as labor. But it was interesting because, so labor unions, the HVALF endorsed very progressive candidates. I say that obviously because they endorsed me, but they also endorsed Ryan Hughes in Ann Arbor, and Brown for mayor in Ypsilanti. And it's just interesting to me, right? Because labor is really kind of like old school organizing and like really strong stronghold for Democrats. And they were endorsing candidates that were different than what the Democratic Party was endorsing. And I would say that they were endorsing the more progressive of the candidates. So I think that this is just an interesting moment. And part of that is because of what is it that we all bring to that table? And are we seeing who's actually making those connections between what's happening with, the issues that matter socially and the economics, right? Like, so we can say in Ypsilanti, I know that the queer community is some of our most at risk of some of the gentrification happening in the community because they do tend to be lower income. And so we can make that case, and we can also make a case for Ypsilanti being a place where people who are queer and all the different families that they have feel comfortable being there. And what happens when we price them out? Where do they go in Michigan? Because they've been coming to Ypsilanti, right? And so we can see that connection, and we can talk about that and talk about how these issues actually are built on one another.
Well, that's to a certain extent, that's a different way of making the connection, because the fact of the matter is that minority communities, especially those who have been particularly oppressed, such as LGBTQ, Black and brown people, are more likely to be poor. To not have those kinds of resources, and so to a certain extent, when the folks go into college or see humanity in these people, that's a step, towards looking at their economic circumstances, but they haven't looked at that yet.
And I think that's the bridge that we have to get people over. I think we have to, one, show them the humanity in people. And once they recognize that, then you can make your economic argument about, like, okay, these are the policies that we need to act to make sure that these people have an equal chance and equal opportunity to succeed in our society. And I think that's a chance that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. But now that these people are more tolerant than ever, we can make that argument.
What do you think, Yousef? Is that a good way to bridge? Are there other bridges that you see? Because, like you said, you've gone across the state in a lot of rural communities, a lot of communities that are traditionally, in terms of voting patterns anyway, very socially conservative, and yet you're representing an area of the state that is perhaps the most socially liberal. Whether or not they're necessarily economically liberal, not a lot of them aren't. But what do you think about how to bridge that kind of divide?
So a couple things. I mean, you walk up to somebody's house, their porch is falling apart, their screen door is tattered. You knock on the door, the person comes out. You can tell that they don't really want to talk to you because you're talking about politics, and they're like, "Look,
hasn't helped me.
Yeah,
Why
what have
should
you
I
done for me
put
lately?"
Right.
Yes.
And it's like, so how can you? If we're not talking about issues that matter to those folks, then we're not talking about the right issues. And if we're not making sure that, every single one of those families can afford to send their kids to college, then they're not going to be able to even fill out that survey. They're not going to be able to interact with LGBTQ students. They're not going to, probably many of them will never be able to interact with any students of color or any neighbors of color. And so when you talk about building diversity and you talk about building inclusiveness, we have to have a conversation about access to education, and specifically access to higher education and community colleges. But part of that too is like the economic part of, I have talked with my colleagues who have said, I don't think the state should be giving any money to universities. They want to completely defund universities. And these are folks who represent, white communities, very poor communities. And I've asked them, why? Why do you want to deny? And their response is, my people are not going to be able to afford to send their kids to college. So why should their taxes go to fund an institution that they're never going to benefit from? And so you have that disconnect. You have that disconnect with people all over the state who are like, why am I sending my tax dollars to the University of Michigan so that a bunch of rich people can get educated? And to some extent, I don't blame them. So like, how do we create a system that makes sure that every family, when they have a child, they can look at that baby in the eyes and they can say, this kid could go to the University of Michigan someday, and actually believe that.
Well, so, I think I just want to say too, the other thing is also thinking about, how, I worked at the University of Michigan for a short period of time, and I also think in EMUs, right in Ypsilanti, and also think about the population of students that go to EMU versus the population of students that go to U of M, and when we think about, like, are the funds actually being shared equitably for those folks, right? Like, does U of M need to have...
Or even between U of M Ann Arbor and U of M Flint and U of M Dearborn.
Yes, and that is very true, right? So I think that those are also important conversations to have, too, because I think if people see that that's happening and that they see the pipelines to, the places that they see in their communities, maybe that would be something that would also help to energize them around that.
I think this is a tremendously important issue for the progressive movement, and I think that the right response is to package at least part of this along with the voting rights stuff that we're already talking about, we're already winning on, because the whole point, the reason for voting rights is because we want a democracy. You can't have a democracy, it's been said for hundreds of years, without an educated citizenry. Actually, it might even go all the way back to Athens that people have been saying that. The idea that you're going to try to have a democracy, and you're going to argue that the government doesn't have an obligation to provide education to everybody, what you're saying is you're intending for that democracy to fall apart. Okay, if we're not investing in the education of the next generation and the next generation and down through the seventh generation, if we can't get that to happen, then we're not going to have a democracy, because we're not going to have enough people that understand the importance of voting, understand how government works, understand how society works in terms of how we come together as a society. I mean, for example, we've had this big argument with the conservatives about we did this on our own. The big Bezos and people like that. Well, they went and they made a big corporation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why should they pay in proportion to what they receive from the society? They did that on their own. Well, so here's the thing. They didn't do that on their own. Our closest relatives that actually live in the state of nature spend 40% of their waking hours chewing. Okay, the fact that we're in a society allowed us to create many tools that have helped us to number one, have more time to, for example, practice being free. By taking our chewing time down from 6 to 8 hours a day to down to something like 45 minutes a day. I mean, literally 40% versus we spend about 4% of our time chewing. The other thing is that if you look at a curve of the size of the size of a mammal's body to the number of years that they live, there's only one species that's significantly off of that line. We literally have double the lifespan of our nearest relatives in the state of nature, and the whole reason for that, or the vast majority of the reason for that, is because we have large interconnected societies that provide tools that that make food more efficient for us, that give us health care, the development of that health care. Nobody did that on their own. Nobody by themselves expanded the lifespan of the members of the human race. And right now, what we're doing in our society by not taking care of taking care of our neighbors is we're reducing that lifespan. That was one of the big things we found, that the lifespan of white men in this country, the average lifespan has been went down just a couple of years ago. That statistic came out. So we have to start talking about what society really gives us. It doubles our lifespan, and it increases our freedom, and increases the time that we have available to use either to work for somebody else or to practice our own freedom. And the problem is, how do we decide what's reasonable? How much should we accept that society demands of somebody to do work for somebody else compared to do what they want in their own exercise of their own freedom.
So you're pro-life and pro-freedom.
I'm pro-life has some baggage with it, so I'm not sure I'd use that phrase. I am, but absolutely, I'm pro-freedom. And when you say I'm pro-life, you're talking about because of the expansion.
Because you said you're expanding you just said we're expanding the length of life that people live. I was just using a turn of phrase that Republicans use often. I didn't mean to suggest
no, you're right.
Access to abortion. But
right.
I'm just saying, basically what you're talking about is the fact that society has enabled people to live longer, which is, life is important. It's important to all of us. Right. And the fact that they're able to use that pro-life mantra is disingenuous and actually is counter to what we as progressives, I think we all believe in life. We all believe in the power of life. We all want to help. That's why we support single-payer health care, because actually not having access to health care kills people. People die because of, how can you be pro-life and deny people health care? Right. Because then you're basically pro people dying.
Yeah.
Which is pro-death. It's pro-death, it's not pro-life.
Right. It's also anti-freedom because, anyway.
And that's another thing. So they use freedom all the time. We want freedom.
Except for women.
And then at what point, and so at what point is it that you're saying that the fact that we live in a society helps to ensure our freedom.
That's right.
Right. And I think making that argument is important to say, when we're talking about things, the societal benefit that can be created out of some of these things, we're not talking about the denial of freedom. We're talking about the expansion of freedom. Right.
And this is, I just want to say from historically, the part of the problem starts in the Enlightenment, with had this idea of the social contract, where in the state of nature you were maximally free. And then when you join the social contract, you give up some of your freedoms in order to gain some security from the society. And this is you gain the security, that's for sure. But to say that you give up freedom compared to what you have in the state of nature is just false. Unless what you're concerned about is your freedom to go around and rape and kill and maim people and take their stuff. Because those are the only freedom.
Or for that to happen to you.
Or for that to happen to you, because the fact of the matter is, unless you're with a big gang out there in the state of nature, that's going to happen to you. Because there's going to be a bigger gang. Okay, and but the fact that I was pointing to is that society creates the conditions under which we can reduce the amount of time we have to spend just to be alive, and that difference, that gap, is our opportunity to have freedom. Otherwise, we're stuck spending 40% of our time chewing.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, you wanted to jump in.
No, well, it's only because as you were talking about that, I mean, any opportunity I have to talk about emergent strategy and thinking about how it can overlay with political and policy life. I take it. And so as you're talking about nature, so I don't, for folks who don't know, Adrienne Marie Brown wrote a book called Emergent Strategy, and I usually have one with me all the time. I like to encourage everyone to read it because she spends a lot of time, and she's talking about emergent strategy, thinking about what's happening in nature, looking at examples, and organizing specifically, you know, thinking about community organizing work and people who do organizing and activists, and how we can use a way of thinking of, you know, a way of thinking differently and thinking about what do we see in nature and how do we live that life, right? I mean, that's not, maybe that's not exactly what she talks about. That's how I took it, because for me, she talks about fractals. She's talking about, and that really spoke to me as I'm thinking about the locality. How do you live your life every day? How do you live your life with your neighbors? You know, my neighbor right next to me, she has, you know, she's, you know, I would say is definitely much more conservative, but not because she necessarily even knows that. And I was talking to her about what's happening in Ypsilanti and like asking her these questions. She had never really thought about those things in that way. And I was like, I know that this is probably not the greatest because she doesn't typically vote. She's voted twice in her life. And because her family told her to and told her who to vote for, right? And so I'm like, well, she might go to the ballot box and she might actually vote against my progressive values. Why am I talking to her? Well, because if I'm talking about, it's about helping people to be more engaged and to make those connections, I have to do that my next door neighbors, within my community, within my city, and have that go out. So this is just one
what their
example.
Existing ideology is.
I wanted to go back to your analogy of chewing. You said we were able to become more free because we reduced our time chewing from 40% of our time to whatever percent. Well, right now in this country, we work about 20% more than people in other similarly industrialized nations. And that's because in the nature of capitalism, employers seek to extract as much profit from the workers as possible. So when you're talking to conservatives who stress things like freedom, we need to make that argument that in our system, we are not as free as we could be because three men in this country, Bezos, Buffett, and Bill Gates, own as much wealth as the bottom half of Americans.
Well, let's put that in some real numbers, though. I would say that speaking in round numbers, every single human being needs about 8 hours per 24 to sleep. About 3 to take care of basic hygiene and nutrition, and about 3 to take care of basic mental, emotional, and social well-being. So that's a total of, 8 plus 3 plus 3 is 14 hours a day that people need just to live a decent life, at the minimum. And those are minimum numbers for some of those things. That means out of every day, there's only 24 hours. So you take 14 out, you've got 10 left. That means out of a whole week, there are 70 hours that we can split up between doing something that somebody else wants you to do so you can have the resources to have those 14 hours a day, and doing stuff that you want to do to exercise your own freedom, okay? And if we have a society, we can measure how much freedom that society provides by looking at how much of those 70 hours have to be devoted to, to doing stuff to support life versus doing stuff to engage in being free. And when we have right now in our society, we have people that work, not just 40 or 50, but 60 or 70 or 80, and sometimes 2, 3, 4 jobs just in order to survive. What we're saying there is we have a society that isn't actually designed to promote freedom. Okay, and when we, in the same way that it's not designed to promote democracy, democracy is an expression of freedom. We don't have either. Yousef, any thoughts on that?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, it's the emphasis that it's not all of society that has to live under those circumstances.
That's right.
There are many people who are wealthy enough to not have to worry about those things. And it's those people that are having to work those 2 and 3 jobs that are being denied freedom. And so I think it's important that we emphasize and talk about that within the context of the economic segregation that's occurring in our country at rates that have never been seen before in our history.
Right. I think that's an excellent point. Let's actually use that as a wrap up, and we'll take a short break, and we'll come back and get into some of these things a little bit deeper.
Hey everyone, this is Benjamin. I'm the director and editor here at State of the Revolution. I want to thank you for watching, and if you like what we're doing, please help support Michigan Progressive on Patreon. We'll be sharing exclusive content that isn't available on our website, like extended versions of episodes, one-on-one interviews with special guests, and looks behind the scenes. We're a grassroots media organization without corporate sponsorships, so your contributions will help us continue to produce content like this. You can find us at patreon.com/Michigan Progressive. Help us keep making the show by signing up today. Thanks again for watching.
Hello, and welcome back with my panel of Desirae Simmons, Hudson Villeneuve. How do you pronounce that again?
Villeneuve,
okay. And Yousef Rabhi. We were just having a really good conversation, I thought, about how to think about some of the problems that we have today in new ways, and the stuff that I was talking about regarding how society generates freedom. Is all scientific. You can go and look at the research about what the state of nature is like for mammals living in the state of nature, and compare that to what we're doing and what actually other hominids did who are now extinct. It's a very interesting anthropological exercise. But I want to talk a little bit more deeply about how to think about some of these things, other ideas about how to present the problems that we have in a way that represents reality, which a lot of the times is not what's happening in the discussion. Any ideas on particular?
Well, one of the things that I've found really useful in my time in politics is to approach these issues with compassion and humanity.
Sure.
And specifically, my example that I like to use is one of my Republican colleagues could not be more conservative. We disagree on most everything, but him and I have a really good relationship. And based on that relationship, we can have real conversations about these kinds of issues. It's a starting point. And before we came into this, we were talking about Thanksgiving, which is coming up.
Right.
So it's like the Thanksgiving episode. Right?
Yeah, maybe we should have one of those.
Yeah, but it's like, it to me is that idea is sort of the microcosm that everybody can relate to of how, when you're sitting at that Thanksgiving table, everybody that's at the table is part of your family. But sometimes you have a heated discussion, and if you do it right, you can have that discussion and still have that good relationship with that person afterwards, acknowledge the differences, but then build from that to find common ground. And I always say, people are like, politics is so nasty, things are so nasty. Politics is just it's a human relationship. Politics is a big Thanksgiving dinner. If you can learn how to navigate that family conversation that you're having with your uncle or your aunt, then you can learn how to navigate the conversation that you're having with the radical conservative from northern Michigan. That's what it's all about. And so how do we have these conversations in new ways? I think we have them with compassion, humanity, and with an ability to listen. Like, give the other person an opportunity to actually tell you what they think. Ask them clarifying questions, not to try to I got you them, but to actually understand where they're coming from. And I think that can really heal a lot of this stuff, but not just heal, but also then lead to understanding that can lead to good policy coming out of it. And that's some of how, we started talking about solar issues. We started talking, and he was one of the people that I introduced the solar panel bills with. So.
Yeah, I think it's.
I'm sorry, I wanted to jump in one. I'll come right back to you, but I wanted to say, in order to do that, one of the things about humanity, compassion, what did you say? Humanity, compassion,
and ability to listen.
Ability to listen. I think there's another piece of that is the willingness to be wrong.
Yeah. And
to let other people be wrong without penalizing them for it. I look at it when for example, a lot of I argue very strongly, and a lot of people tend to think that I'm just, this is the way and that's the way it is, and I'm not like that at all. Actually, what I actually want is what's actually happening is that I've thought about these things and I have very strong positions because I've had lots of arguments where I've been wrong and I've gotten to a better position by having been wrong. And what I'm looking for is to somebody to look at the argument that I'm making and show me where I'm wrong, but don't ask me to not be forceful about the argument that I have, because I have reasons behind it. So I think that's that kind of mentality in our culture, that being wrong is bad, as opposed to a learning opportunity. And that when somebody's wrong, you get to call them out for being wrong, like you somehow won something.
Right.
What you won is a society that has one more person that understands the world better. That's a win for everybody. That's not something to put down somebody for. Yeah, I'm sorry, so go ahead.
Yeah, so, this is really interesting because when I think about kind of new ways of sharing information or building relationship, it's easy to think about how you can build these relationships across difference when it's like you're sitting at a table, you're looking in someone's eyes, you can shake hands. But so much of communication now is happening online, right, in social media and all these other ways.
That's a great point.
And a lot of these political conversations are being hashed out. I mean, in Ypsilanti, we have the Ypsilanti area discussion board, and now we have a cup that says, "I survived the Ypsilanti area discussion board." But it's interesting because like so many people in my life are always like, "Desirae, stop! Why are you having these conversations with people that are not going to see your way? You're just like wasting time." But the evidence for me that I see actually goes against that. One of the things that's so great for me right now is like when I meet people in real life. So it's like, you create this kind of social media persona. And if you're consistent enough, people get to know that. And so then I meet people out and about and they're like, "Oh, wait, I saw you. I kind of feel like I know you." And then you meet each other, and then now we've built that relationship. There are people who I've been working on for, months. It's like, just little by little. And then there's people I'm like, "Oh, wait, now I found a sliver. I found an area." Either one of us made an argument, as you're saying, that reached a way of thinking that now we can connect on. And then I can say, "You know what, how about we take this conversation offline?" So I think that that's the next thing is in areas where you can, to try to see if you can have these conversations that might start off really contentious. It's really hard to talk about nuance when everyone is kind of staunch and just trying to put their information out there and they're like, "Well, you just aren't seeing it." I think it's also important that as we think about that, the importance of conflict and how conflict is actually the space where we learn about each other's values. That's the space where we learn about what's important to people, because the things that they won't change on, then we know that that's actually the core of where we are. And I think we need to be able to be more comfortable with conflict than we are. We need to realize that in a society that's traumatized by all the things that we're living in, that people aren't going to all come and say things in the way that we want them to say. Everyone doesn't have the same language. Everyone deals with trauma differently. And so we need to actually kind of put our egos aside, I think, and to be able to be willing to say, "You know what? I may feel like I'm right," because I often do. But maybe in this circumstance, I might not be totally right, right? Because I don't have your perspective. And maybe if you could at least be willing to understand that there's a perspective different than yours, then we can have a conversation.
Not just a perspective different than yours, but a perspective different than yours that isn't ridiculous.
Yes. Yes, and that might actually
that
force,
isn't automatically ridiculous because it's not yours.
And also that might require you to give up something, right? Because that's the thing that's the hardest part, is that, in order for us to be able to have a conversation, you need to give up something, right? There's certain conversations I'm not going to have with people, right? Like if you're going to deny somebody's humanity, like I'm going to stick on that point until we get past that, right? Because I'm not going to talk in theory. This is real life. So
I want to come back to that, but you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think these are all fantastic points. We have to listen to people. We have to give people the ability to be wrong, and we need to be compassionate and treat people like human beings. But we need to do that all the time, and not just when election season is coming around.
Right.
On an individual level, we can all be better at listening to people, but in terms of a political movement and in terms of the Democratic Party, we need to be talking to these communities all the time, not just when we need something from them, like their vote. Everyone keeps talking about how Detroit's on a comeback. Well, certainly Woodward Avenue and Dan Gilbert are on a comeback. But when you go out into these communities in the Detroit metro area, they don't see any of those benefits. And I think the Democratic Party needs to, because they see that as a secure voting bloc and they don't have to do much, I think they need to spend more time reaching out to those communities and listening and hearing their struggles and what needs to happen.
We spent, I fully agree with, that's a very concise way of summarizing, I think, some of the biggest problems that the Democratic Party has. I think we take our base for granted. And I've had these conversations with my colleagues over the last few days. And one of the things I pointed out is we took one of our traditional bases for granted, which is blue collar working people from places like Monroe County and Macomb County and stuff like that. We took those people for granted. They left us. Who are we taking for granted now? We're taking for granted people in Detroit. We're taking for granted folks in Flint, who we know will traditionally come out and vote for us, majority people of color. We know that they'll come out and vote for us. So why spend any time there? Why spend any time working with them? Why spend any time supporting those communities? They're going to come out and vote for us, so who cares? So we need to have a strategy, I think, and the Republicans are really good at this, by the way. You know, who did they elect as their speaker? They elected the most conservative guy as their speaker, and they're electing the second most conservative guy as their speaker this time, or one of the most conservative. And so, and what they've figured out, I think, is that they're not going to run away from their base. They're going to go to their base, the people that voted for them. They're going to say, we stand with you, and in return, we expect you to stand with us so that we can move the needle on some of these other seats. And I think they've done a really good job of that. I disagree with a lot of what they're doing, but you know, when you see them doing that, and then we as Democrats were like, well, let's try to be moderate. They're not trying to be moderate. They're not doing anything moderate. They're trying to make sure that their base is active and excited. And so we need to make sure, what do the people in Detroit want? What do the people in Flint want? Why aren't we fighting for that? Because those are the people that, you know, if we can turn out, 100,000 more Detroiters, if we can turn out 20,000 more people in Flint, that's a game changer on a statewide ballot. That's a game changer.
And we need to realize that sometimes this move to moderation is actually moving us to the right, right? Because that's the thing is that they get more
that's
extreme,
how they define moderate,
right?
Point.
Well, and so thinking about it, if they're putting up their most conservative folk, right? So then that means that the base that's most conservative, they're seeing the. I don't really like this term, but he's like, when are the Dems going to throw the progressives red meat, right? So we see that happens on the conservative side, right?
All the time.
All the time. They're like, hey, you want some? Here you go.
The first bill they introduced was eliminating complete tax cut, income taxes. Right? That's exactly what that's red meat for their base.
And for their donors, because we were actually hearing in the news that they were coming right out and saying, our donors said, if you don't do this for us, we're not going to give you money next time.
Well, it's a tactical error, I find, that we have within the party, because we're not doing that, because we're always tacking over. And as I say, the numbers are more, it's going to be more and more on the left, and people are, and you're going to see all these different groups, or as we're seeing, saying, well, what about my everyday life? And they're is going to move further over. And so where do they go?
And a problem with this asymmetric polarization we're seeing within the parties right now, where the right is going further right, and then the left is moving more towards the middle, is then when you have a party that's in the center, and then you have a party that's far right. When you compromise, that compromise becomes a right-wing ideal and a policy that doesn't really represent the ideals of the people. So we need to expand that spectrum of ideas and expand that spectrum of argument, so that when we do come to a compromise, it's in the middle of where the two parties stand and where the people stand, not a middle between a centrist corporate party and a far right ideologue demographic.
But so one of the key things there is the progressive movement that's making arguments like healthcare is a human right. And by the way, one of the things that comes out of society generates freedom. What I talked about in the previous segment. One of the arguments that comes out of that is I just lost my train of thought. There it goes. But I lost it. I'll come back to it. Yeah, go ahead.
So based on what you just said, and maybe this is for a different discussion at a different time.
I got it back now when you're ready.
We don't have enough time to talk about all this, but
sure.
One of the things that I'm trying to grapple with, right, is this idea of like money in politics and the impact that has on parties, right? Because you have pressure on political parties to say, well, we need to raise money to win elections, and so in order to do that, we need to be able to go and you're saying the corporate whatever. So if they have money, that's where you're going.
Exactly.
So we can't. I think it's important that we think about ways to empower the Democratic Party and elected officials within the Democratic Party to find alternate sources of being successful with fundraising and at the ballot box that don't involve them having to rely on those large donors. Because, I can tell you, just looking around Lansing, you can go to one lobby firm and they can write you a $20,000, $30,000 check, and that's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to go out and spend days and months and years raising that $30,000 if you were raising it from individuals. I know Bernie's got a great example of an operation that was able to do that, but it's a lot of work and it's a lot of energy. So I think one conversation needs to happen that I've been trying to, I don't have the right answer. I mean, I can do it for my own, you know, but how do we do it now as a party? How do we expand that to an entire political party? And so, you know, if we set a goal for ourselves of saying we need to raise as much money as we did in the 2018 election in 2020, but what if we decided to not raise any of that money from PACs and special interests? And what if we decided to say, screw all the corporations, we're not going to help them out anymore, but then that means they're not going to give us any of their money anymore? How do we raise those, you know, probably tens of millions of dollars at this point from
Before you
traditional
touch on your
funding
idea,
sources?
Leon, I want to chip in. There's this radical thing going on in Seattle right now. I don't know if you guys have heard about it, but the city of Seattle sent everyone in the city a $100 voucher that they could give to local candidates of their choice. And that really kind of changed the way grassroots fundraising did to try to overcome the impact of corporate donations. So coming up with solutions like whether it's sending everyone a $100 voucher to give to local candidates, whether it's public campaign financing, or whether it's just simply embracing progressive ideals that inspire people to donate to you. And, you know, in some races, you're going to need some big donors. But what you can do is not take donations from the fossil fuel industry and certain industries that directly impact your policies. You can sign pledges and take money from other industries that maybe don't as affect it. So I think the Democratic Party needs to embrace ideas that inspire grassroots donations. I think we need to look in public financing for campaigns and ideas like that'll make the process more democratic.
I also think. Well,
sorry, I got back to my idea.
Can I just finish this one
sure,
off
go
before
ahead.
you change us somewhere else?
Go ahead.
Because I do think it's important to think about, you know, when thinking about the money, right? Some of this cost is like it gets astronomical. So what does it mean if we actually don't need all of that, right? So some of these costs, some of the things that are most expensive, you know, thinking about like television, advertisements, you know, this is what people see. Like for some people, this is all the information they get. And it's kind of horrifying. Like I fast forward through them and I feel like I don't want my daughter looking at it. She might get nightmares. Just looking at ads, political ads.
Right.
But that's where we spend a lot of money, right? You know, so where do we spend all this money? And is it actually improving people's lives? And when I think about the progressive ideals that people want us to be focusing on, a lot of the questions are like, what all the money that we put into getting elected, like how much that actually could go into directly changing a person's everyday life. And that's a big issue. So I think that this is an issue that the Democratic Party is going to have to look at as actually being something that we're going to have to take a stand on, and to say that we're going to have to make a gamble. If we actually address this so that people connect to it on a visceral level, will they come out and knock those doors? Will they come out and find other ways of working their networks? Can we think about how people are actually making decisions about who they're electing, which is through their personal networks, right? Can we actually energize and focus on that so we actually have to spend less money? That means we could raise less money, but that actually means we're energizing more people, and people are now going to come to us because they say, this party's values are my values. So I think that there has to be
I feel like we need like a test
space.
case almost, like a test case to
let's
show.
test it.
But I want, you know, because then you can't really go to the party and be like, hey, do this and stake everything in the 2020 election. And then if it doesn't work and we lose the entire election, then they will never, ever, ever do it
But we might
again.
lose anyway, right? But this is the thing. It's like
And
doing
so
it
how do
as we
we-
are now, we are already losing.
But so how do we test it and then show them like, this is an example, like we had with Lori Pohutsky in Livonia. Now we can go back to the party and we can say, you can run a progressive campaign and be a Democrat and win an election in a red seat. Well, how do we then take that and say we can run a campaign not based on these other things, if you know? And here's an example of doing that.
Yeah.
And so I just think when
No,
I just raised the issue because I think practically this is like what I'm facing like every day, like the party and the
it's like
and the
how
caucus
do you build up the
is like we need to
undergirding?
do this, we need to do this, we need to do this, and it's like, well, if I'm saying we need to do less of that, how do we? What's the alternative? How do we present that alternative? How do we say what are the people going to do? How are the people going to respond? And what has to happen first? So it's
Right.
just like, let's think about the practical
Right. I think
nuts and bolts of how
one
we
of
can
the
do that.
solutions we can do that is just letting primaries be open and not having the party influence.
Oh, I'm
those primaries.
100% behind
You
that.
know,
That is a complete waste of time
Right.
and money.
Yeah,
in
we
my
have the
opinion.
establishment backing certain candidates so that, I mean, the DNC just voted to reduce the power of superdelegates, but, when we actually let the people choose their candidates, then I think we will have, that is a solution to that problem.
Well, I always say it's like survival of the fittest, right? Like the best candidate gets through the primary.
Mhm.
That's
Well,
That's
if you
what
have an open
if
primary.
you have an
Yeah.
open
Open
primary.
primary.
Right.
Yeah, and if it isn't, that's what I'm saying. If the
Right.
party
Right.
says
Back.
we're going to let the best, then the person that actually resonates with the voters,
Mhm.
that runs the best campaign, that knocks the most doors,
Mhm.
that is the best
Mhm.
candidate, wins the primary.
Well,
And then it becomes,
again, you still have
Yes,
the
I
problem
agree.
of the influence of big money in politics, though.
Right, and that's what I'm. That's
so
what I'm,
even in the
and
open
that's what we're
primary, I'm
talking
saying,
about. Yeah.
yeah.
But so many times the party has come in and said, we're going to influence the
Right.
primary, and we're going to push it in favor of one person or another.
right. But
And if
a
you-
lot of the time, that's by directing donors,
Mm-hmm.
or donors directing the party,
Right.
depending
and
on
that's,
how you
and
look
that's
at
what
it.
I'm saying. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So having the open primary is a step in the right direction, but I'm just saying that that's not that we still have to work on the money out of politics part.
Absolutely.
Of that. And I want to make sort of like I made the point earlier about how we have this this weird factually incorrect concept of the relationship between society and freedom. We also have and as a result, a lot of the times we're talking past each other when we're talking about how do we advocate freedom, but then we're having these policies that totally don't, because they don't strengthen society, they weaken it. Society being the source of our freedoms. Another one where I see that we talk past each other left and right a lot, and maybe tell me if you think that this makes sense, is the strongest objection that the quote unquote left has to capitalism is actually not markets necessarily. There are some people on the left that think that markets in and of themselves are bad, but that's actually a relatively small minority. There are many more who say markets can be good tools of the economy in certain circumstances when properly regulated. And a lot of conservatives wouldn't even necessarily disagree with that. It's the radical, very, very far right that want complete laissez-faire, no regulations, etc. But when the left makes points against capitalism, they're not necessarily talking about markets. They're talking about wealthism. And what I mean by wealthism is, in analogy to racism, people who behave, whether or not they consciously believe it or not, that by having more money they ought to have more influence over how everybody else lives, and they do that through the government. That's a term that is not used very often. I thought I might have coined it, but actually somebody else did it a few years ago. I found that welcome to the internet age. But I really think we need to separate this idea. We need to be clear when we're talking about capitalism. There's two parts of it in the way that it's used in our culture. There's wealthism and there's markets. And the left complains about wealthism, and the right responds by talking up markets. And so I think we need to make this distinction clearer in our public discourse, so that we can talk about, hey, I don't necessarily have a problem with markets as an efficient tool for setting the prices for scarce commodities. That's what they're supposed to be, and there's a lot of good evidence that they can do some of that. There's some evidence against it. That's another long discussion. But what I'm really, what's really concerning about capitalism is the wealthism aspect of it, which is that it's a completely ridiculous idea that if you have a lot of little organizations, when I say little, I mean like maybe 1,000 people or something like that, where a very few people, 20 people maybe, decide what to make, where to make it, how to make it, and what to do with the proceeds. And to think that in that organization, it's going to benefit everybody reasonably equally. And then if you have a whole bunch of those all over the country, that somehow that will benefit everybody, reasonably equally, and it just doesn't. It's just factually incorrect, because what we have is 1% of the population owns something like 75% of the stock in all of the companies in the U.S. And they decide what to make, how to make it, where to make it, and what to do with the proceeds. And a lot of the times what they decide to do is, hey, we can make more money if we produce it over in China or in India, or now that China's coming up, they're going to, Vietnam or Malaysia, et cetera, different places around the world. So being able to separate this idea of wealthism, which is an authoritarian top-down, control the people under you and extract resources from them, it's basically feudalism, from use of markets. Does that make any sense, having that, trying to bring that distinction into public discourse?
I just thought you said Yousef markets.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also thought you said that.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry.
No.
Is there a market in Yousef? I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe it'll be like a grocery market.
Okay.
The Yousef markets.
Okay.
It's interesting because for me,
Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
It does make sense, and I'm trying to think of. I'm like, okay, so the way I'm thinking about when I think about what I see is what folks especially see as challenges, and what I see as the challenge, like how that fits into what you're talking about. So you tell me, because one of the things I think about it is that the problem is that capitalism doesn't just stay within an economic sphere, it's in our social sphere. And so then people start saying that we value people who are up here making this money more than we value the people who are actually making them the money. We value what you need because we think that you'll share it with us more than we value what we can produce as a community together. And so I think that that's where some of the issue is that it's become part of our value statement. And so then we say, well, if you don't have money, then do you really deserve to have all your basic needs met? Maybe if you just stop being so lazy, right? This then becomes part of the way that we hold and how we think about one another, and that value piece, which is not about, it's not just the way that wealthy people think about top down, it's also how it's infused each of us, right?
Absolutely.
Just the way patriarchy, just the way all these things that they become part of our way, of our lens. And so I think that that's part of that challenge, is that we have to tease out and keep whatever's supposed to be about market, or the way that we think about spending and how we exchange goods into one sphere, and the way that we think about one another and our relationships, and the value that you get needs to be in another sphere that we can all have access to equally.
So I'm not sure that you can actually separate those, because we interact with each other when we do whatever kind of commerce that we do. And so I think that what we need to do is we need to stop pretending that humans are like machines. And that's one of the key problems with the way that we think about markets now, which is one of the things I think we ought to be criticizing more and more strongly and more directly, which is that when people in here, especially very conservative people, will say, I'm never going to let anybody pay me less than what I'm worth. That means that they don't actually understand how a market for labor works, because the way that the market works is that the company has to pay you less than your labor is worth to them on the market. And the way that they do that is they say, well, you're worth what you're worth on the market. You're worth what you're worth in competition with everybody else. Okay? And I'm not against having a competitive system necessarily. There are aspects to it that are very useful in certain areas, again, with the right kinds of regulations. But the problem is that what you're doing is you're treating people the same way that you treat machines. A machine you buy on the market based on how it competes and compares with other machines on the market. If you do that with people, then you're treating people like machines. You're going to pay people on a paradigm that you use exactly the same way to how you buy machines. And I just think that to me, that's the point where we have to say, no, people are not machines. You don't pay them what they're worth in a market like that. You pay them at least a minimum that human beings need to survive in whatever the context of the economy is. And if you can't do that, you have no business being in business. I mean, I think FDR said basically the same thing. If you can't pay your people enough to live, then you have no business being.
Well, I love how you use machines, because I came out of my most recent employer, I feel like treated me like a slave, actually, because they felt that they can pay me. I was being paid quite lovely for this area. I was being paid more than the median income of Ypsilanti by at least double. Had healthcare, all these things. And apparently they felt that that meant that they could treat me like crap, right? And I learned from people who have been there for years, especially Black folks, that they felt like hated, felt like abused. And we're like, well, we're just going to hold on to retirement because this is the best game in town. And that's so a monopoly will operate that way, no matter if it's an elite university or, or
a near monopoly.
Yes.
So
I think that that's something, this is part of that breaking down of saying that this is not a value judgment just because I need to earn a wage so that I can have a place to live, so I can have health care, right? Because now when I don't have those things, now it's like, great, yeah, like we're just left to the wind. But I'm not willing to trade my humanity for a paycheck, but I'm not motivated in that way. Right. And it's at my behest, right? Like I'm the one that suffers from that.
Right.
So.
We've got to wrap up here in a couple minutes. Any last thoughts?
I would add to Desiree's point. I think, and a lot of people are forced to make that decision to trade their humanity for a paycheck. They have unexpected children, or they have health problems, or they have family members they need to take care of, disabilities, anything.
Their car breaks down.
The car breaks down.
We have no public transportation.
Exactly.
To speak of.
They fail out of a class, so they lose their scholarship or something. Any situation forces us to trade our humanity for hours of our lives that we never get back.
There goes our freedom.
And there goes our freedom, exactly. So we need to create a better system that allows us to have those basic needs met, so that what we're earning is extra.
Right.
I really like what you said about the impact of our economic system on our human interactions and how we talk about other people, because I hear that a lot, right? I hear when I talk about my universal health care plan, people say health care is not a right. What they're saying is you should only be able to have health care if you can afford it, which translates the economic model into an interpersonal model of saying, well, you're not as valuable as a human being as me because I have health care and you don't. But the reason is because I have money and you don't.
Wealthism.
And that's wealthism. And that's the human aspect of wealthism that you're saying is non-separable from the economic aspect of it. Which I think, I think that's spot on, because it bleeds into all these other issues that we're talking about, and how the right tends to message on them, and talks about, the Medicaid work requirement issue is a perfect example of it.
Sure.
Of saying, in order to be as human as me, you have to work even if you can't find a job, even if you don't, even if you're watching 3 children and can't go get a job, even if you are, all these circumstances, you're not as human. And so having that separation that comes, and it becomes even more dire than that, right? It becomes, like we were talking about earlier, a life and death scenario. Like if you don't have as much money, then you die. And if you have the wealth and resources and the privilege to live, life is a privilege now. And that's not the society that we really want to live in.
Absolutely.
I think too, like it's so important to think about, we've been talking about relationships so much, and I think that that's really important too when we think about people in different economic spheres. I think that we have the least amount of mixing across economic spheres. I think it's the area of our diversity that we don't have a lot of intermingling, because it doesn't happen naturally, because we're not in the same kind of social spaces. I think one of the areas that does happen is on college campuses, that's a possibility where some of that happens. But
that's actually part of education for democracy, as far as I'm concerned.
I think it definitely could follow along with that. I know I have, my own personal experience allowed me to be in that space, but that was because I went to a boarding school with folks that were very wealthy, and then those of us who were not, got thrown into this kind of space and had to learn how to swim double. But what that shows me is that, I have people in my network who have very different kind of economic reality than I do. And you know what? Right now, they've been paying attention to what's been happening in Ypsilanti because they're connected to me. They care about my success. And they're saying, oh, wait a minute, what's happening and then they can see what that looks like in their own spheres, and that they have different spheres of influence that because they're connected to a person like me, that now maybe that helps to leverage other relationships in different ways. And so I think it's important for us to think about, as we think about expanding democracy, it's about expanding those opportunities to get people in a space together to have those conversations. You know, I want to talk to folks about philanthropy and charity, and what would it look like if we just instead taxed you more so that we don't have to have you decide, right? Because the government would be better able to actually use those resources without you deciding. So those are conversations that you only can have if you have a trusting relationship with someone. And I think that that's what it's going to take. It's going to take people who live in poverty to be able to have a conversation with a person with money and not feel like they're going to leave it feeling like crap, and not feel like they're going to leave it feeling like you just took something else from me, right? Without my knowing it. So I think that these are the things that's going to take. That's the hard work that we have in front of us. But I think it's possible, and I think that there's a lot of this happening. I think there's a lot of examples of people starting to see, like, oh, wait a minute, your humanity is tied to my humanity, and maybe if we come together, that we actually can get further.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and you'll have the last word. So I want to say thank you to Yousef Rabhi, Hudson Villeneuve, which I still got your name wrong. I'm sorry. I'll get there. And Desirae Simmons. Thank you all very much for coming, and join us again next week for another episode. Thank you.